It's Thursday, October 16th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today on the show, the Supreme Court is getting ready to tear down a fundamental piece of how we vote and who we vote for. The justices heard a case this week about a key piece of the Voting Rights Act meant to protect minority voters from discrimination and making sure they're represented by their elected leaders, and the conservative majority seem poised to throw those protections out. So, I'm going to talk about the Voting Rights Act, the case we're talking about, how ending these protections has been a lifelong mission for the Chief Justice of the court, and what it means if the court does what it looks like it's going to do. But first, make sure you're following or subscribe to the show on whatever podcast app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications if you're a watcher on YouTube. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got a brand new piece dropping actually at about right when you're probably listening to this. It's all about Jack Smith, the former special prosecutor, coming out of the woods to go on the record in praise of the process of good law. It's really interesting stuff, but you can only get it if you're a paid subscriber. You can also subscribe for free to get access to a bunch of other great things I've got up there. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. All right, let's get to the show. I try hard on Make It Make Sense to give you a complete picture of the biggest stories, but I'm only one guy, and staying up to date with events around the world can be difficult for anyone when it's impossible to consult a single source for the full story. And with our social media algorithms sending us the versions of the news that only reinforce our own biases, it can be hard to know if you're actually informed, even for me. And that's why I've been using Ground News. Ground News is an app and a website that combines news from around the world all in one place, so you can compare coverage from every news source, and you can see if they have a political bias, how reliable their reporting is, and who owns them. My favorite feature is the blind spot feed. It highlights news disproportionately covered by one side or the other, so I can make sure I know how the news is being covered. It's like Make It Make Sense for Make It Make Sense. Right now, if you subscribe through my link in the show notes, you'll get 40% off the Vantage subscription. It's the one I use to get unlimited access to every feature, and it is just $60 for the entire year or $5 a month when you use that link. Your subscription helps Make It Make Sense, too. We get a cut of this subscription, but you're also helping Ground News make the news more transparent. Again, use the code in the show notes to get 40% off your Vantage subscription to Ground News. All right. Let's get back to the show. On Wednesday this week, the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in a case brought against the state of Louisiana by, quote, non-African American voters who thought they were being denied proper representation and that it was a violation of their right to equal protection under the law. You see, in 2022, Louisiana redrew its district maps. And just a quick refresher, the district you vote in is drawn by the state, sometimes by independent committees, or as in the case for Louisiana, by the party that controls the legislature, which is Republicans right now. Now, that map was drawn in a way that, despite the state being one-third black Louisianians, black folk in Louisiana were only the majority in one of the 6 districts in the state. A judge said that likely violated the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965 and forced the state to redraw the map by 2024 so that it was proportional to the black population. The state did that, creating 2 majority black districts, and that's when these non-African American voters sued. Now, this made its way up through the courts, with the next level of the court being an appeals court panel of 3 judges who said the map actually was illegal because it's sorted by race, and eventually the Supreme Court put a stop to that order, allowing Louisiana to use the map with 2 black districts for the last election. But they wanted a closer look, which is how both sides of this fight ended up in front of the highest court in the land. Now, I know on its face, it seems like, the idea of discriminating against people based on their race or engaging in discrimination to help someone because of their race seems bad. But I haven't told you about what's in the Voting Rights Act yet. And hang tight here because this is going to be a big section of some American history you probably haven't thought about since high school. In fact, this entire episode is a little dense. So, The Voting Rights Act, or the VRA, was one of the crowning achievements of the civil rights movement. It was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965 and made it so Southern states couldn't discriminate against Black Americans when it came to voting and representation. So this was things like banning literacy tests or poll taxes when Black people went to vote, which are literal reading tests, or forcing people to pay to be eligible to cast their ballots. But the important part for what we're talking about today is Section 2 of the VRA, which says a state can't use a practice in running its elections, including creating maps that, quote, result in a denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. And that denial has to be taken in totality, so across the state, to show that elections are not equally open to participation by members of a class of citizens who are protected by the law. So in plain speech, that means that if you had a state like Louisiana that was 1/3 Black, a third of the seats needed to be representative of that. Not that Black people always get their way or that Black people are always elected to those seats, but that they weren't perpetually in the minority of their districts on the whole. And I know that's a little confusing to wrap your head around, and trust me, it took me a little while for all of this to sink in, but I'm going to press ahead because in 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that Section 2 could only be applied if there was an intent to discriminate, which, as you can imagine, is incredibly hard to do, making it pretty easy for most Southern states to try and cut back the voting power of Black Americans, especially those states that did not like the civil rights movement. But then just 2 years later, in 1982, a bipartisan bill was signed into law by Ronald Reagan extending the VRA against the wishes of many of his voters and party members. We'll come back to that in a minute. Now, that new signing also said that voters could challenge election maps or processes if the discrimination, intentional or not, was extreme. And everyone shook hands here and just, walked away. Until 1986, when the Supreme Court heard a case and made a ruling that redefined the VRA again. This time, it set out 3 clear conditions that all have to be met in order for someone to challenge a state's election map. First, is there an electoral law, process, or structure involved? If so, does it interact with a social or historical context? If it does that context minimize or cancel minority voters' ability to elect the people they want? And there's sort of a fourth outside condition that the discrimination had to be extreme based on, again, the totality of circumstances like racially targeted campaigning or racially motivated barriers to voting. Essentially, this 3-part test is a way to make sure that minority voters aren't losing elections based on race instead of party. Though that can get pretty murky because most often race and party affiliation are really closely aligned. People of color mostly vote for Democrats, white people mostly vote for Republicans. Now, it's a pretty high bar to clear, and it's been the bedrock of how states have had to work for nearly 40 years now to make sure we don't slip back into Jim Crow-style elections. But for a long time, Southern states and conservative leaders have been upset that that bar is so high. Chief among them is Chief Justice of this Supreme Court, John Roberts. Now, before Roberts was Chief Justice or even a judge, he was a clerk for the conservative Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who, among other things, thought the court case Plessy v. Ferguson, which said that segregation was a good thing, was right. Roberts was considered a, quote, loyal foot soldier in the fight to limit the VRA and landed a job as an influential aide in Reagan's administration. Most of the time, he was working to have Reagan not renew the entire VRA, and then was later tasked with taking point about why the law shouldn't be changed from forcing Black people to prove an intent to discriminate. A former deputy director of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, which even under Ronald Reagan generally supported Section 2 of the VRA, told Politico, John seemed like he always had it in for the Voting Rights Act. I remember him being a zealot when it came to having fundamental suspicions about the Voting Rights Act's utility. Now, listen, people can differ on politics in a lot of ways, but when a top lawyer for Ronald Reagan, a president who was caught on tape calling Black people monkeys, I know, look it up, but when a guy who answers to that kind of a guy thinks you're too zealous about discrimination, maybe it's time to take a step back. Now, ultimately, Reagan signed the law, and Roberts was obviously frustrated, and he has since built his legal career essentially having it out for the VRA. And the idea that if we're not careful, the U.S. is going to slide into some sort of quota-based reverse racism, which clearly it did not do, nor was it ever going to happen. But he spent 45 years on this work, and now he has a chance to get what he's always wanted. And this week, he was backed up by the conservatives on the court and the state of Louisiana that's now arguing against its own map. Members of civil rights groups are arguing that map should stay in place and say if Section 2 of the VRA is gutted, the effects would be catastrophic. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly how many people would be affected by it, but it would likely be in the millions, given that congressional districts on average have more than 760,000 people. You can see how that number of minority voters who could lose a say in their elections would grow quickly. And it's not just black voters. In recent years, states like Florida or Texas have gone out of their way to try to force a growing Hispanic and Latino population into or out of districts, including this latest attempt to redistrict in Texas. But maybe the easiest way to see how people will be affected by this is by looking at just how many seats Republicans stand to gain by allowing rampant discrimination back into our voting systems. Because, like I said before, race and party are closely aligned. The New York Times put out an article today showing across the Deep South, that's Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas, Democrats would lose 12 seats in the House. That's around half of the seats they hold now in those states. That's a huge swing in favor of the Republican Party, on top of the move to redraw district maps in Republican states across the country ahead of the midterm elections next year. So what that would mean is that first, millions of people of color would have their voting power at best diluted or more than likely made completely worthless, meaning it would be a lot less likely Congress would care about their interests in things like supporting black businesses, supporting historically black colleges and universities, and keeping black communities safe, because the people who represent where they live don't really have to answer to them because they don't need their votes in the first place to stay in office. And on top of it, regardless of how you feel about discrimination laws or whether, like John Roberts, you think the VRA is, quote, gone too far, gutting this portion of the law would more than likely mean the entire country would end up under what would effectively be one-party rule with almost no way to undo it. And we've seen in states that are already heavily gerrymandered that in order for people to win their races there, they have to run further to the fringe and the crazy edge of their parties to prove in those highly partisan districts, because they've been drawn that way, that they're the best person for the job by being the most extreme. And if what we get is a Congress full of people who are as extreme as it gets, and arguably we are well on our way for that right now, that's bad for everyone. So, the Voting Rights Act, as much as people like John Roberts want to say is undermining fairness by focusing on a minority of people, it's actually protecting the majority of us from a different minority of people from taking over, and that's a good thing. So, if you're asking what you can do, the answer isn't just to call your congressperson, although that is good, but it's to pay attention about what's happening in your state. These election maps, they're drawn at the state level. You should know what's going on in local races and know who's in charge of your elections, because if the Supreme Court does what it looks like it's about to do, local and state people are the ones who will be in charge of what happens next. All right. Thank you for sticking with me for this episode. I know it was a lot and it's really dense, but that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show on whatever app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, leave a comment below. If you're a watcher on YouTube, let me know what you think of the show. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack for free right now. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.